Hey friends, our last video talked about the age of absolutism in countries like France, Spain, Austria, Russia, Prussia, but not quite in England. England is always going to be the one exception where kings and queens couldn't quite do everything that they wanted. And this dates back to actually like 1215. I joke with my middle school students, but lots of times if you've seen this movie, Robin Hood, this is actually a portrayal of King John, the First of England, who was famous. This is the movie Robin Hood, and I don't know enough about whether Robin Hood was real or not. I know it's based on like tales, but like King John was basically this bad king who was taxing the people in England and waging wars that nobody wanted. And in 1215, for one of the first times in history, a group of barons at Runnymede met with the king and said, "No, you can't just do whatever you want." And ever since then, England has been like flirting with this idea of again limiting the power of kings. At this point, the Tudor monarchs in England still believed, my dog is right next to the microphone, go away, dude, in divine right, but still recognized a shrewd value in keeping a good relationship with Parliament, which is again a body representing the people. Kings again still continued to claim a divine right to rule kingdoms no matter what, saying that their power actually didn't come from earth but came from God, which was this convincing argument for why kings should have their power. Henry VIII, who my students, here's a photograph of him, or a picture of him consulting with Parliament, but my kids know him from the oversimplified videos and this painting from Hans Holbein the Older. Henry VIII, he's the guy who had all the wives and divorced his wife and started a brand new church. His daughter, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, ruled England. She only called Parliament 13 times in 45 years. Elizabeth I, famous for defeating the Spanish Armada, which we saw in an earlier video. And I put a picture again of Congress here because I teach students who are in the US, and Parliament is kind of the same idea of the United States Capitol, the legislative branch. You elect people to represent your interests in Congress. And when she died childless in 1603, the crown passed to James I, and the Stuarts of Scotland will take control of the monarchy of England, and what's called the Century of Revolution will soon begin. We had the Stuarts and we had the Tudors, two dynasties. I always write that Shakespeare wrote during this time period, and he wrote some of his happier stuff while the reign of Elizabeth I was on. That's when he wrote All's Well That Ends Well, A Midsummer's Night's Dream. And then when James I comes along, the Scottish king, he writes some of his darker works like Hamlet and Macbeth, which is my favorite. So a century of revolution it will be, and a century of revolution will change England and really world history. Here's a quote from King James I. It again reaffirms the right of a monarch, saying that a monarchy is the most perfect form of government that exists. It makes sense. This is the only way to do it. And again, England, ever since 1215 with the Magna Carta, has been operating with this sense of you are a king, you can make major decisions, but not quite all the way. For a variety of reasons, England has always been seeking to curb the power of the monarchs. If you actually read the Magna Carta, it's fascinating. It's really a lot of barons and nobles representing or stating their interests and their claims, which led to a limited monarchy, which brings us back to one of the essential questions that we had with this section, but I'm not there yet, actually. James I, though, that king, clashed with the Puritans, who again wanted to purify the church and change its practices. We still are dealing with the effects of the Protestant Reformation in 1517, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses on the church in Wittenberg, and we have these clashes between different religions. James often rejected their demands, saying, quote, "Harry them out of this land or else do worse." And it's interesting, harry them out of this land, slowly but surely. This is the time when many people seeking religious freedom would start to again leave the old world, England, and start to come again into the new world. In this case, lots of Puritans would begin to come to the 13 colonies. Ooh, the box didn't work. Still, wars between and among different religious groups were widespread during the age of absolutism. You don't even need to see the full box. You know that one already. James I's son, Charles I, assumes control of Parliament. He was actually forced to sign something called the Petition of Right, which prohibited the king from raising taxes without Parliament's support. Parliament is still playing a major role in attempting to limit the power of the king. Charles I will assume the monarchy in England, but he will largely ignore the petition while also dissolving Parliament, saying you're no longer a body that acts to represent the people. This is going to start the century of revolution. Also, too, James I, the King James Bible was introduced during this time. One of the major goals of the Puritans was to extend and expand widespread literacy amongst the people. They made a Bible that was available in English rather than Hebrew or Greek. The Long Parliament. From 1640 to 1653, perhaps the most influential representative assembly ever assembled, sought to curb the power of the king. It would lead eventually to the English Civil War, the Long Parliament. In 1642, Charles I, the King of England, led troops into the chamber to try to arrest the more radical members. The radical members, in a feat of bravery and escaped through a back door, raised their own army, and then the war began. Cavaliers, those who supported the king, would clash with a group called Roundheads, those who supported a more limited monarchy and Puritan values. Here are Cavaliers defending the king. Here are the Roundheads, who are arguing for a more limited monarchy and the impact, a more influential parliament. The Roundheads would be led by a figure known as Oliver Cromwell, who will play a very, very influential role in English history, which is, I try to describe on the next slide, a little bit complicated, but he takes power and leads a rebellion basically against Charles I, as he again here tries to arrest members of the Long Parliament. This is the Long Parliament in England. These are all representatives of the people of England who are trying to say, let's limit the power of a king. Cromwell created what would be called a new model army and will eventually defeat the Cavaliers. Charles I in 1649 was put on trial and labeled a tyrant, a traitor, a murderer, and a public enemy. He would be beheaded and executed. It was the first time in 1649, I don't know why I circled that like 6 times, that a king was tried by his own people and executed. Like, wow. Like, again, for hundreds and hundreds of years, for thousands of years, people thought that they were put on earth by God himself to rule over people. But the English are like, no, this isn't right. This isn't the way it should be. Kings are fallible. We need a new system of government. It was the first time in Europe, first time I think in a lot of different countries, where a monarch was executed by the monarch's own people. Kings had been assassinated before, and kings had died in war before, but never had they been executed by their own people. So what happens next? I put it shows up on, okay. This is from Hamilton. Winning is easy, governing is harder. So what happens next confuses me. It's complicated, and I hope I get it all right, mostly. But here's again a fundamental question. How much power should the government have? How much power should be invested in a king or in a president or in a ruler, right? Like, democracy is not perfect, and we're not even to a democracy yet. And every generation should really seek to improve upon what exists. But what is right and what is what is wrong, right? These are decisions that we should be asking ourselves. How do we govern ourselves? And the English were asking them this question in 1649, when for the first time they got rid of a king. And what is it about power that always attracts humanity and people to assume positions of power? Because what happens next is quite complicated. So again, this is going to be a lot of the smaller ideas that still make up the bigger ideas. Sometimes I get bogged down in what happens next, but these, again, smaller ideas make up this bigger ideas. How do we govern ourselves? How much power should the government have? So Oliver Cromwell, again, assumes control of England. it is declared a commonwealth and a republic. Those who supported the king's heir, Charles II, though, still waged war. Cromwell waged war against the Irish and brutally suppressed Catholics in the region. England was undergoing kind of a Puritan revolution in which the very fundamentals of everyday life would begin to change. Cromwell ruled as a virtual dictator. His legacy is somewhat complicated. I confess that I would need to read more about it in order to provide more information about who Oliver Cromwell was and what his legacy is within English society. But Puritan ways of life begin to dominate English society. So taverns, theaters, gambling, all of that is prohibited. Poor Shakespeare, his plays probably took a hit during this time. Women were still subordinate to men, but interestingly enough, romantic relationships were encouraged as compared to business relationships. Lots of times in this period of history, you married someone based on their connections, their influence, their money. But Puritan values said that's not a fundamental basis for a happy relationship. We should instead encourage intimacy and companionship among one another. Cromwell eventually died in 1658, and England was so exhausted by the change that Parliament invited Charles II, the son of the beheaded Charles I, to come back and be the king because, again, this is still playing. Governing is difficult. It's just easy to say, you make the decisions, and they picked Charles II. This period becomes known as the English Restoration. Charles II was very popular. He encouraged advancements in the arts and in the sciences. Many influential English Renaissance or English Age of Enlightenment thinkers like Francis Bacon and John Locke and Isaac Newton advanced in the field during this time. There was a Great London Fire in 1666. You can remember it by the last three numbers, Great Fire. And the foundations of London were destroyed, but the foundations for modern London would be built during this time. And after Charles II passes, James II assumes the throne of England and is very open with his Catholic faith, angering by now the very Protestant England. So here we go again. In 1688, Parliament became so dissatisfied with James II that they invited James's Protestant daughter, Mary, and her husband, William III of Orange, to become rulers in England. James II fled to France, fearing a revolution. William and Mary took control of England in what became known as the Glorious Revolution because there was no bloodshed. And here's the big idea. It's so important. In 1689, the English Bill of Rights was passed, which ensured that Parliament would again play a major role in limiting the power of a monarch. Parliament would play a much more significant role in governing a society. It couldn't just be the king. Also, too, there was the idea of still habeas corpus. I'm getting a little bit better writing with this new pen. This idea that you must have a trial before you are convicted of any kind of a crime. There are certain rights that you have no matter what that are above any kind of arbitrary urge or whim of a king. And this English Bill of Rights in 1689 is going to inspire what my mostly American students understand as the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment of Rights, right? The freedom of religion and speech, this idea constantly that you have rights that are guaranteed to you no matter what. And we saw with this section, with this confusing English Civil War, that this is the time period when in England, the rights of the monarch are beginning to be curbed, are beginning to be limited. And we're saying, this is the new way that we are going to govern ourselves. And after all of this is going down, an enduring question again is we should continually question, is this the best way to govern ourselves? What's the best way to ensure that everyone truly is entitled to their life, their liberty, and their pursuit of happiness?